Authentic is sponsored in whole by Voice of Prophecy.
Today we're going back to a 17th century philosopher that we've actually talked about in the past. But now we're going to look at his lasting legacy and why a lot of people are finally starting to realize just how wrong this guy was and how right the Bible is by comparison.
Welcome to Authentic. Shawn Boonstra explores real existential questions about the meaning of your life and how you can live a genuine human existence. Listen every week right here on this station or on your favorite podcatcher. Here's Shawn with this week's episode of Authentic.
I know that to ordinary, everyday people like me, this idea that some philosophers actually agonize over the possibility they don't exist seems kind of foolish because, well, to most of us, existence seems kind of obvious. I mean, if there was any question at all, it would have been resolved the day I placed my stepladder on an icy sidewalk like an idiot and climbed up to the roof. The moment I reached the top rung, I suddenly felt the bottom of the ladder start to slip out from under me, and I knew full well that in a matter of seconds, I'd be experiencing a rather significant amount of pain. You know, that brief moment where you realize you're about to get hurt and you've got no choice but to ride out the experience. Let me say, the moment I hit the sidewalk, and I hit it so hard I bent the ladder, let me tell you, I had no question that my physical existence is very real. And it occurs to me that when you come across these religious cults who insist that the physical world is just an illusion and that things like illness don't actually exist, what in the world goes through those people's minds when they fall off the roof? Ooh, this isn't real. It's just in my head. The pain's not real. My broken jaw isn't real. Just how long can somebody sustain that thought when they've got to go to the emergency room to have a medical professional set their broken arm? Just a few years ago, I had to endure a rather uncomfortable surgical procedure that involved feeding guide wires through my back into one of my internal organs. And as usual, they had some trouble anesthetizing me. I guess I'm just one of those lucky people with red roots in his beard who doesn't really respond to anesthetic. At least I don't really twilight. And so I was awake for the whole procedure. And I've got to tell you again, that disabused me of any notion that the Inquisition is over. So here's the question. Was all that awful discomfort just an illusion? Or does my body actually exist? It seems like a simple question until you consider the fact that the sensation of pain actually happens here, upstairs in your brain. I mean, it seems like your knee hurts or your elbow, but in reality, that's your brain telling you something is wrong with your knee or your elbow. Ask a paraplegic if his knee hurts, and he's probably going to tell you no, because the signal no longer makes its way to his brain. This is also the reason we actually know the answer to the question. If a tree falls over in the forest and nobody's around to hear it, does it still make a noise? And the answer is no, because sounds are just your brain's interpretation of disturbances in the air. If there are no eardrums present at the moment the tree hits the ground, there are no sound waves, so there is no sound. That's why truly deaf people hear absolutely nothing. The link from their eardrum to their brain has been compromised. The same thing happens when you get older. Look, the world around you isn't getting fuzzier as you age. It's just that the capacity of your eyes to perceive it has diminished and the signal to your brain has been compromised. This is one of the reasons that a lot of philosophers have struggled with the nature of reality. They realize that there's something of a disconnect between our minds and the physical world. The people who write those strange movies like The Matrix aren't just coming up with a brand new plot that nobody's ever thought of before. They're tapping into the angst of a long line of deep thinkers who have wondered if the world around us is actually real, if we can actually trust the evidence of our senses. And of course, the number one name that most people think of when it comes to that question is René Descartes, who gave us the phrase, "I think, therefore I am." Or if you want to sound sophisticated, you can say it in poorly pronounced Latin like me, cogito ergo sum. Now, I know that I've talked about Descartes on another program 2 or 3 years ago, but I was thinking about him again just the other day, and sometimes that's how I decide what we're going to talk about on the show. And the work in question today is Descartes' Pensées, or Meditations, which was the first full-fledged philosophical work I ever read when I was a kid. I mean, if you don't count the popular works like The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy or Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. I think I was 17 when I first read Descartes, and back in those days, I certainly was not a practicing Christian. I mean, I had a Christian background, but I wasn't living it. And you know, I went and tried to find my beat-up old copy of Descartes in my library for today so I could pull it out and show it to you, but I think it's in my storage locker somewhere, so I've got an iPad. And as weird as this sounds, Descartes actually played a pretty significant role in my spiritual development because at the tender age of 17, as I was reading him, I found myself getting excited by the fact that he was making a reasonable argument for the existence of God in kind of a roundabout way. Now, today I recognize that Descartes' thinking has some rather large gaps. There are intellectual problems, but at 17 he blew me away. I found myself thinking that God might actually be real. And while my teenage self didn't really get around to adopting Christianity at that time, there is no question that Descartes actually helped me take my first steps down that road. And so his work, well, it holds a place of honor in my library. It's one of those 20 or so books that most people have that prove to be game changers in your life. So, getting back to the subject at hand, our ability to know that our existence is real, well, Descartes is pretty famous for moving the needle on that one. And again, we're walking into an esoteric realm, a place where philosophers usually hang out by themselves while the rest of us are relatively happy living here in the real world. But still, it's important that we recognize what the eggheads in the ivory towers are thinking about because their ideas really do have a way of eventually trickling down to the minds of everyday people, whether it's through college classes or even through popular TV shows. I mean, here we are, living in a world that continues to struggle with ideas that we all used to take for granted. For example, once upon a time, we all understood the concept of truth. We had an objective view of the world, and we understood that two contradictory things cannot possibly be true at the very same time. To put it the way Aristotle did, A cannot equal non-A. But today, we don't speak like that anymore. We don't speak about the truth. Instead, people talk about my truth and your truth, and we've even coined a new word to describe what we think might be true, but we're scared to say it's true, so we use the word truthiness. It's a way of saying it's true without being too definitive about it. So yeah, some of the bad ideas that come from those ivory towers, ideas that were mostly harmless when they first popped up in a classroom, they can have a profound impact on the way that all of us think and behave over time. And I honestly believe that we're currently witnessing some of the negative impact of choosing to believe that nothing is actually objectively true. So here's what we're going to do today. I've got to take a break in a moment, but let me set the table for our study with something that happened back in 1619, 1 year before the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock. On the night of November 10, Descartes had a series of 3 different dreams, and they were game changers for him. He'd been wrestling with the idea of truth and how you and I could know if something is actually true, and when he went to bed that night, his subconscious started to answer those questions. And I'll be right back after this to tell you what he learned. Hey, Shawn Boonstra here. Did you know you can watch Authentic every week? Yep, just search for Authentic with Shawn Boonstra on YouTube. It's that easy. Catch new episodes every week during our regular seasons and watch for free. And while you're at it, would you tell 1 or 2 people about the show? Thanks for your support.
This is Authentic with Shawn Boonstra and the Voice of Prophecy.
On November 10, 1619, René Descartes had what you might call a hat trick of dreams, 3 disturbing nightmares in a row. In the first dream, he found himself crippled and struggling to walk, and the wind was blowing him around as he tried to get about. He noticed that the other people around him didn't have the same problem. They could walk just fine. And he tried to make his way inside a chapel to pray in this dream, but he couldn't get there. I mean, you've had dreams like that too. You can't walk. So Descartes became afraid that a malicious demon was leading him astray. That was the first dream. In the second dream, he hears a loud noise and becomes enveloped in this shower of sparks. When he wakes up, he sees his fireplace and he figures that the crackling of the wood caused the dream. Then he had a third dream where he sees a book sitting on the table. Here's the way he described it. After a short time, he wrote, I go back to sleep once more and find myself in a third dream. In front of me on a table is a book. Having opened it, I see that it is a dictionary. Then I notice a second book, this one a poetry anthology. I flick through it and immediately come upon the Latin verse, Quod vitae sectibor iter. Which path in life will I choose? The two books, he figured, were symbols for different things. The dictionary, of course, was a collection of facts, and that, he reckoned, was the nature of this world, of living here. Throughout our lives, you and I gather all kinds of data through our five senses. We collect facts we believe to be true. But over time, those same facts kind of devolve into a massive pile of disconnected thoughts. And what most people want is to find a unifying principle that ties all that information together so that the world begins to make sense. But the book of poetry, in Descartes' opinion, that was the music, the beauty of the created universe, and it represented the unity that holds this physical world together. Incidentally, the Greeks would have called that unifying principle the logos. It's where we get the word logic. And you'll notice that when the disciple John begins his gospel, he identifies Jesus as the logos. Now, we think that's because some of the early Christians were starting to dabble in Hellenistic thinking and adopting some really bad Greek ideas. Those people would have said that the Creator and the Redeemer were two different beings. They were borrowing that from pagan philosophy. So John sets the record straight in his gospel by telling us that Jesus is the Logos. He's both the Redeemer and the Creator, and he's the principle that holds the whole universe together. It's an idea that Paul backs up in his letter to the Colossians. But let's get back to Descartes and his dreams. When he woke up from that third nightmare, it really shook him. The dictionary was cold, hard science, and the poetry was wisdom and philosophy, or what he might have called revelation and enthusiasm. It's tempting to summarize them as facts and feelings, but that would be oversimplifying what was going on upstairs in Descartes' noodle. Now, normally, most of us don't put a lot of stock in dreams unless you're Nebuchadnezzar getting a message from God. But for Descartes, these nocturnal images kept bothering him. They were like your tongue returning to a broken tooth at the back of your mouth over and over and over. And it was that produced Descartes' most famous work, his Meditations on Philosophy. Now, I'm not going to bore you with all the details, but maybe let me try to summarize his key argument. Here's the way he begins, and I'm guessing this is going to resonate with quite a few of you. Here's what he says. Some years ago, I noticed how many false things I had accepted as true in my childhood, and how doubtful were the things that I subsequently built on them, and therefore that once in a lifetime, everything should be completely overturned, and I should begin again from the most basic foundations if I ever wish to establish anything firm and durable in the sciences. Of course, that's really pretty good advice. There does come a time in everybody's life when you're going to want to assess what you've always been told and ask yourself if it's all true. I actually went through that process when I was in my early 20s, and it ended with me believing that the Bible really is inspired by God. Now, sometimes when I was a little kid, I used to wonder, how do I really know that I'm not just a brain on a table in a science class out on an alien planet somewhere? And that my day-to-day experience isn't just the product of some alien kid poking my brain with an electrode. Descartes essentially asked the same question, but in his version, he used a malicious demon. How could he know for sure that his sensory experience wasn't being caused by an evil demon who was trying to deceive him? So here's what he did. In order to figure out what's real, he set about doubting everything. That's what he meant when he said he was going back to basic foundations. He needed to put everything to the test. So, to illustrate, let's take something that most of us believe is true, the fact that we have two arms. Most of us do. When I look down at my body, there they are. And when I look in the mirror, there they are again. But how do I actually know that? Is a mirror really solid evidence? How do you know it's not just an elaborate illusion? Well, if you have any doubts, Descartes said, that belief, if you doubt it's got to go. What he really wanted was to find something that was so unquestionable, so certain, that it left no room for doubt. And as you might guess, at the end of the day, he wasn't left with much, because you can doubt just about anything. So he ended up rejecting all the evidence of his senses, which left him with nothing but his thoughts. And that's when he wondered, how do I even know that doubt is real? What if my doubts are also being planted in my head by that demon? And that's when the lights went on. If he was doubting his doubts, well, he was still doubting. So it seemed like the ability to question stuff in his mind, well, that was certain. So then he went a little bit further and asked, how do I know that I'm thinking? What if that's an illusion? But again, it occurred to him that if he was thinking about thinking, well, then he's thinking. And so that also seemed undoubtable. Here's what he actually wrote in his Discourse on Method, and this is the thing that made Descartes famous. He said, I resolved to pretend that all the things that had ever entered my mind were no more true than the illusions of my dreams. But immediately afterward, I noticed that while I wanted thus to think that everything was false, it necessarily had to be the case that I, who was thinking this, was something. And noticing that this truth, I think, therefore I am, was so firm and so assured that all of the most extravagant suppositions of the skeptics were incapable of shaking it. I judged that I could accept it without scruple as the first principle of the philosophy I was seeking. Now, I know that some of you are wondering what in the world that has to do with you, because you haven't wasted much time wondering if you exist. But there's an unexpected consequence to this philosophy that has affected most of us, and it boils down to his systematic separation of the mind and the body. What Descartes was left with was a kind of dualism, where the physical world and the world of the mind became two different things. We can probably thank another philosopher, Gottfried Leibniz, for that, because he said that if two things are going to be identical, they have to be identical in every single detail. That idea was already being circulated when Descartes started to philosophize. And obviously, from his perspective, mind and body were now two different things. He could count on the existence of his mind, but he couldn't count on the existence of the physical world. It wasn't a new idea because the pagans had been teaching that for thousands of years, and the Greeks became famous for promoting it. But as we'll see when we come back from a really quick break, there's a serious problem buried in there. I'll be right back after this.
Got kids? Get Discovery Mountain, a free weekly audio adventure to build their faith. Discovery Mountain. It's a place where the air is clear. So clear you can almost hear your imagination. A world of Bible-based wonder for kids everywhere to grow their faith and get closer to Jesus Christ. Discovery Mountain. Free weekly content that'll inspire and engage. Listen anywhere you get your favorite podcasts or at discoverymountain.com.
This is Authentic with Shawn Boonstra and the Voice of Prophecy.
The ideas that René Descartes became famous for are sometimes called substance dualism or Cartesian dualism in honor of his last name. It's the idea that your mind can exist without your body, that it's a separate entity all by itself. In this way of thinking, the body is just a meat locker for your ghost. It can't think or exist just by itself. Now, this way of thinking leads to something that philosophers call the mind-body problem, which questions how the mind and body actually relate to each other. And again, I know it sounds like a lot of academic gobbledygook, but hear me out. Because according to Descartes, one of our most prominent Western philosophers, the mind and body are two separate things. But then our day-to-day experience tells us every day that's not really true. Really bad news, for example, is comprehended upstairs in your mind, but the tears that come to your eyes, that's a physical response. So there really is a connection between your mind and your body, and there's no way they're completely separate. Likewise, I can stand at a door and imagine that it's opening all day long. But it's not going to happen. It's not going to open unless, doing magic tricks like Uri Geller. You can picture it, you can visualize it, but to make the door open, my brain is going to have to tell my hand to reach out and grab the doorknob. The mind has to rely on the body to get things done. And I know a lot of us were raised on the idea that the mind is actually independent of the body, and that we can float off after we die and live some kind of disembodied experience. That's really the essence of dualism. But let's think about that for a moment. If that's really true, if you can completely separate mind and body, then how do you explain what happens to people who take psychoactive drugs like alcohol or LSD? Those drugs operate on physical principles. They change your brain chemistry and they alter how you perceive the world. These substances dampen the reliability of your senses, but that's not the only thing that happens. They actually change the way you think. I mean, just visit a courtroom sometime and listen to the number of people who try to excuse their awful behavior by blaming alcohol. I wasn't thinking straight, Your Honor. Well, why not? Why weren't you thinking straight? If the mind is completely separated from the body, then how did molecules of alcohol change the way you think? We all know that drunk human beings will do things they would never consider doing when they're sober. Alcohol lowers your inhibitions, and the crime stats prove it. According to one study I was reading just a little while ago, 53% of the murders committed in the United States were fueled by liquor. 57% of the rapes, 47% of the robberies, and 60% of physical assaults. They were motivated or at least emboldened by liquor consumption. And tragically, something like 80% of suicides involve alcohol. So clearly, alcohol dramatically changes the way you think. So now let's ask ourselves, how could it be that the mind and body are two separate things? The reasonable answer is they're not. And wouldn't you know it? That's the description of human nature you actually find in the Bible. Contrary to popular thinking, the Bible does not separate the mind and body. And I know for a lot of us, that's a big pill to swallow, but hear me out. I'm reminded of something Jesus said. He was talking to the Pharisees who were really upset because he was healing somebody, and unbelievably, they started telling people that Jesus was healing people through the power of a demon. So now listen to how Jesus responded. He said, "You brood of vipers." I like some of Jesus' responses. "You brood of vipers, how can you speak good when you are evil? For out of the abundance of the heart," he's talking about the mind now, "the mouth speaks. The good person out of his good treasure brings forth good, and the evil person out of his evil treasure brings forth evil." Okay, it's not really rocket science to discover that your thoughts affect your behavior. But let's consider this from the perspective of substance dualism. The Bible presents your mind as a fundamental part of your body, not something that exists entirely on its own. What happens when somebody develops one of those horrible degenerative diseases like Alzheimer's or dementia? At the root, it's a physical problem. It's the breakdown of the brain. And there's no question that the physical breakdown is changing the person. Their personality changes. Their ability to comprehend and analyze the world begins to dissolve. What's going on? A distinctly physical problem is altering the mind. This is precisely why so many modern philosophers are now rejecting Descartes' dualism. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't match reality. And it doesn't match what the Bible teaches either. According to this book, that all-important connection between your mind and your body ends up being exactly who you are. Your thoughts change your behavior, and your behavior changes your thoughts. I'll be right back after this.
Dragons, beasts, cryptic statues. If you've ever read Daniel or Revelation and come away scratching your head, you're not alone. Voice of Prophecy's free Focus on Prophecy guides are designed to help you unlock the prophetic mysteries of the Bible and deepen your understanding of God's plan for you and the world around you. You can study online or request them by mail. Visit BibleStudies.com and start bringing prophecy into focus today.
Welcome back. It's Authentic with Shawn Boonstra and the Voice of Prophecy.
There's a really interesting passage in the book of Proverbs that kind of underlines what I was talking about with mind-altering chemicals. Just listen to what this says, and you can find this in Proverbs 31. It says, "It is not for kings, O Lemuel, it is not for kings to drink wine, or for rulers to take strong drink, lest they drink and forget what has been decreed, and pervert the rights of all the afflicted." So again, let's think about this. How in the world can we believe that the mind is somehow independent of the physical body when we know that the mind can be dramatically altered through physical means? The wise man tells the king that rulers cannot afford to consume alcohol because it will make them forget God's moral precepts and they will, quote, pervert the rights of the afflicted. Their ability to think has been compromised by a physical reality. So, do I think Descartes was right? Well, yes and no. I believe he was right when he observed two things. First, your senses can deceive you. Secondly, we do know that we actually exist. More than that, we can know that our existence is meaningful. Of course, I've got to give credit where credit is due. Descartes was one of the first people to help me realize that the Christian faith is perfectly reasonable. But dualism? A split between the mind and the body? No. As a student of the Bible, that's something I just can't accept. The Scriptures give us no reason to believe that the mind is something other than your brain. That's why brain injuries can change your personality, and physical diseases can compromise your cognitive capacity. Your ability to think clearly declines as your physical body goes. You know, when Moses died, the Bible says that his eye was undimmed and his vigor unabated. And of course, the reason it points that out is because that was highly unusual. It's considered somewhat miraculous. The rest of us, we lose a lot as we get older. My stamina isn't what it was when I was 18, and my eyesight isn't the same either. And as much as I hate to admit it, my mental recall isn't as sharp as it used to be. I mean, I can't even begin to count the number of times I walk through the house to go get something, but before I get there, I forgot what I was looking for. And if time should last, I know full well that my mental acuity is going to fall apart. Why? Because my thoughts take place in my biological hardware. And as my body wears down, so does my cognitive ability. In the beginning, the Bible teaches, God created us with a decidedly physical existence. Go back and read it. Then when Christ came to live among us, He actually retained His human physical existence for all time. You find that in the encounter with Thomas at the end of Luke. Jesus rose with a physical body. And when God restores us, He brings us back to what we had in the beginning, an earth made new, a place that was physical, and God said was very good. Maybe it's time to pick up this old book and see just how much it agrees with everything we're learning about this world we live in. Thanks for joining me. I'm Shawn Boonstra, and this has been Authentic.
You've been listening to Authentic, sponsored by Voice of Prophecy. Remember, you can listen every week right here at the same time. And thank you. Authentic is funded by listeners just like you. You can support at voiceofprophecy.com. That's also where you can find all the episodes you missed, or where you can listen again. That's voiceofprophecy.com.